Gail and I were talking about our Center for the Future of Museums a minute ago, which is an initiative that we started in 2008. And it's been one of the most successful things we've ever done at AAM, and a lot of other nonprofit associations have come to us and asked us to help consult with them about how they can create something for their own field. The libraries, the American Library Association has asked Elizabeth Merritt, who runs the center for us, to consult with them. She's done some work with the League of American Orchestras. No other nonprofit or association, cultural association, has done anything like this. And Beth has done a fabulous job of helping museums look at ways in which changes in society are affecting museums and affecting how people view museums and how people use museums. And she's looked at things as disparate as 3D printing and how that's going to affect museums in the future. And her Trends Watch 2013 was very, very popular. 2014 is coming out in a few weeks. But there's a lot of how people use their leisure time. In 2013, she did an article about the phenomena of small apartments, these tiny little apartments in big cities that basically have a bed and a bathroom and a chair. And there's no common space, there's no place to entertain. And so these are affordable apartments, they're fully equipped, but they're, I mean, I probably couldn't move if I were one of those. But this then puts forth an opportunity for museums to become that common space where people, young people especially, can come together and meet. And how can museums meet that need? How can museums reach out to become a social center for groups of young people who are looking to get together? What do you need to do, besides what your mission, besides your artwork, or besides your science exhibits or your natural history exhibits? And we're seeing a lot of that. The other big change for us is that, and Beth has written a lot about this, is museums as educational institutions. Now, that seems very obvious, but museums are not seen as routinely as educational institutions. And so they get overlooked. And there's a thought, I think, especially among elected officials, that the field trip is something like the field trips that I went on. That was a long time ago, where it was really a nice opportunity to run wild through the big open halls of the museum. You know, it was fantastic, and you saw some things on the lawn as you did that. But today, all field trips at all museums are geared to specific state standards in some one way or another. They reflect the state standards, and often they actually list the state standards that are being addressed in the field trip. So it becomes a really important educational program. The center hosted a convening in Washington, D.C. in September last year, which we hope is the beginning of something much bigger. We had 50 invited participants, which included the Gates Foundation, the George Lucas Foundation, the McCormick Foundation in Chicago, the National Science Foundation, National Academy of Sciences, National Endowment for the Humanities, Smithsonian, and many other foundations, and Department of Education was there. Teacher of the Year 2012 was there. We had really a great mixed group of policymakers, of thinkers in education, educators there. There were some great museums represented. The Children's Museum of Boston, which does some really, really interesting community outreach with their education programs. And our goal of this convening was the role of museums in strengthening K-12 education in the 21st century. And the white paper about that is also coming out probably in 2 weeks. We did this in partnership with the Henry Ford, the museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The Henry Ford is a leader in museum-based education. They run 3 high schools, one on the campus of Greenfield Village there in Dearborn, and they are very, very committed to the role of museums, especially in thinking about creativity and creative thinking. And we know museums are good at that. We know museums can help do that. So we are looking forward to building on that so that people, so we can be we'd like to be at the table. We'd like museums at the table when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is reauthorized. We've never been at the table. Nobody ever comes to us and says, well, what would you like to see in this massive piece of federal legislation that oversees public education in our country? We know that museums play an essential role in helping young people learn and in providing lifelong learning opportunities. So we're very, very focused on that. The other thing that we do is that we accredit museums. We're the only organization that accredits museums of every type. The zoos have their own accreditation, the zoos and aquariums have their own accreditation. Even though I'm a veterinarian, we don't do animal things. But we do accredit zoos and aquariums as well. We just don't do the animal piece. And we work with their association to sort of have a collaborative effort around our accreditation programs. But in general, art museums, history museums, children's museums, science technology centers, natural history museums, we accredit those. And that's really important because we want, if we're going to talk about museums as essential educational institutions, we also have to be able to talk about standards and best practices that we adhere to, that the field adheres to, that are evident in everything that we do. Just as people expect colleges to be accredited, we think they also expect that museums in their work will be accredited as well. So for a long, long time, there was nothing, and then there was accreditation. It was like going from 0 to 75 in one step. And that's a problem we had to address. We had to create a system where there was an entry point and museums could work along that continuum to get to accreditation, because only about 6% of museums in the United States are accredited. Now that 6% represents, and that includes this museum, which didn't need any help getting along the way, it just got accredited. So that 6% accounts for probably 30 to 40% of museum attendance, 30–40% of museum budgets. All the big museums are accredited. But we want everybody to be working toward that, to be at some stage. So we created this continuum where the first thing you do is you sign a pledge of excellence. It doesn't commit you to anything. It just says you will meet this, you will do everything you can to meet the standards and best practices of the museum field. And then we have a program funded by the government, funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the agency that awarded the Czechoslovak Museum and Library the National Medal for Museum and Library Service last year. That's a program called Museum Assessment Program, where museums can begin to look at how they can incorporate standards and best practices into their daily work. So we're hoping, and then we went, what a concept, we're taking the accreditation program paperless to make it more accessible, to get rid of, I'm embarrassed to say that Gail probably knows, the applications weighed 35 pounds. So last December we went live with our online reaccreditation program, and in a few weeks we will go live with our online first-time accreditation program, and we went in and hacked out all the underbrush, that I call it, that had built up over the 40 years that the accreditation program's been in existence, because nobody ever took anything out, they just kept adding. It's a great program. Museums that go through it always talk about what they like about it. One of those things is the peer review. And so the accreditation is based on self-study and peer review. So 2 peer reviewers will come and look at the museum and work with you. And every time I've talked to a peer reviewer, even from the biggest art museums in the United States, they say, every time I do a peer review accreditation, I learn something. And it's a great two-way exchange between the museum and those peer reviewers. So we're really trying to make that a much more universal program, and we just launched that. We're just last September, and we're just building it through now with the paperless component. Our standards and best practices in the United States are viewed as the best in the world. So in 2009, we were approached by the Chinese Museums Association. They wanted to find a way to have access to American standards and best practices for their museums. And so we worked with them to translate 10 of our books. I think they're still working on it, actually, but into Mandarin. And the first one was presented by the Chinese Museums Association at our annual meeting in Los Angeles in 2010. They were very proud of that book. And the cover had one thing on it, the Statue of Liberty. And that's all. And I thought, wow, that's I didn't know if they could get away with that, because the Statue of Liberty was a big symbol in Tiananmen Square. So, but they wanted that book to reflect that this book contained our standards and best practices, because they wanted to be able to emulate those. And subsequently, we were approached by the Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil company. They are building a billion-dollar cultural center in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, which includes several museums, a children's museum, a natural history museum, and an art museum, a community center, a library, an archive, a performing arts center. And they wanted their museum staff to be fully versed in American museum standards and best practices. And so we have an ongoing partnership with Saudi Aramco, which we're helping them train their staff both in country and by having them over here in the United States. We've completed a program in Mexico City based on standards and best practices. We've signed an agreement with Brazil. So our standards and best practices are admired absolutely everywhere. Apart from that, we do a lot of the typical things that associations do. We do continuing education, and our annual meeting, which is coming up in Seattle, May 18 through 21. We'll have about 5,000 people there from 50 countries. It's the largest museum gathering in the world. It's a little like drinking from a fire hose, but there'll be 160 educational sessions that attendees can choose from. And again, we'll have the whole range of museum professionals, from entry-level interns up to heads of major organizations. We will offer simultaneous translation of our international track in Spanish, Mandarin, and Arabic. And we are also offering a CEO track for the first time, which we'll see how that goes. If it goes well, we'll continue that. That's being hosted by the Gates Foundation in Seattle. So education is a big part of what we do as well. So, Gail, what have I missed that you'd like me to talk about? I'd love to hear questions. But
well, I'll ask the first question because I'm sure there's lots, and that's always the best way to have a discussion. We are looking at heading into a more expanded education program ourselves, and I'm wondering what you're seeing in museums that is the most successful programs, and what are people doing out there?
yeah, I mean, obviously the field trip remains a staple of museum education, but also museums are increasingly taking the education to the schools. School budgets, especially getting kids to the museum, school budgets have really been cut in a lot of places across the country, so it's hard. It used to be you could get buses for a field trip in the budget, but that isn't the case too often these days. So museums are looking at ways that they can go to the schools, and that may be through broadcast programs, or it may be through actually going to the schools and putting out programs as well, and training training docents, incorporating other educators, and having them go to the museums. There's a lot of work being done around if you're going to have that field trip, there's work that goes on ahead of the field trip in the school. So there's a curriculum that the students work through before they actually go to the museum, with the goal of maximizing the experience that the students have when they get there. So they're not just seeing the material or what they're going to be learning about for the first time. Museums are looking for all kinds of creative ways. At our convening, there was a lot of focus on the shift from the focus on the teaching to the focus on the learner. What does the learner need? What does the learner want? Museums allow young people, the learner, to really go where they want to go and develop their knowledge and expertise. Beth Merritt, who runs our Center for the Future of Museums, talks about growing up in Cleveland and struggling in school. But every day she went up to the Museum of Natural History there at University Park in Cleveland, and she went into the library and she read. And that became her passion. And that directed her into biology and a master's degree and being a curator, because she was able to go to that museum and follow her interest. And even though she was still in school, but she was using the museum to develop what would become her passion and her career, until we diverted her slightly into the Center for the Future of Museums. So that focus on the learner is something that museums can do very, very well and help young people follow what their interests are. I like to think that my interest in animals, and my becoming a veterinarian, is related to my having gone to the Natural History Museum at the University of Minnesota many times as a child, and developed a lifelong love of interest in animals and animal biology and medicine. So I think we'd love to see more really interesting school museum partnerships. Museums are starting schools in their buildings, and that's there's a number of those around the country where museums actually have elementary schools, or in the case of the Minnesota Zoo has a junior and senior class high school. Others have elementary schools. I was just in Orlando at the Orlando Science Center. They have a preschool, a science-based preschool program for children. Really, really good. We got to see them spend some time and see the curriculum and see how the teachers are interacting. These are little kids, pre-K, and they're doing all kinds of science-based programming. And that program is sold out. They have no ability, unless they build more space, they have no ability to expand it. It's very, very popular, and I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing as well.
Can I, just to
Yeah.
follow up on that?
Please.
It sounds like that's a Montessori approach, focusing on the learner. Is there a museum that you know that follows that Montessori style of
I don't know if it's exactly Montessori or not. I can't say. There's a wide range. As I always say, if you think of something that a museum might be doing, the museum is doing it. It's just a question of finding it. The San Diego Zoo has not San Diego Zoo, the museums in Balboa Park. Maybe you've been out there at Balboa Park. They have all those fabulous museums. And they have the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, which includes 12 museums. But San Diego Zoo is the core, but also the Natural History Museum, and the Museum of Man, and the whole range of museums, the two art museums, and they all work with two schools with children who have a high percentage of children who are in the free lunch program, who come from disadvantaged economic backgrounds. And they come and they spend 30 days doing classes in those museums. And that has absolutely, it is a model program that is being emulated all over. The city loves it, the school board loves it, because it gets these young people into a totally different educational, three-dimensional learning experience. And there's zillions of these programs out there. Cataloging them all is really difficult, because lots of museums are doing these educational programs in slightly different ways. Yeah.
The link between museums and creativity piqued my interest for some reason.
Well, museums, that hands-on piece. Now, there's always this thought, well, what do art museums do? They're places where people go and you stand and look at things on the wall. Well, I believe that the human mind does not silo creativity. Creativity is creativity. Einstein said the best scientists are artists. He himself, of course, was a musician. And when we get young people exposed to art at an early age and creating things with their hands, that and expressing themselves, that creativity that we nurture at a young age through those programs is going to develops the creative mind, which is going to spill over into other disciplines. Because the mind does not just say, oh, okay, art, creative art. It's creativity across everything. And so I think that's something that's underappreciated in the role. And lots of museums find ways to engage young people around creativity. Designing ecological studies programs in a natural history museum. How do you look at population changes? How do you look at the impact of something in the environment on a species? How do you develop the research program to look at that? These are the things that get young people thinking, it's hands-on. And museums have a unique ability to do that. Yeah.
Following up on Chuck's comment about creativity, I'm thinking of our region here, which is known as the Creative Corridor. So University of Iowa is right down the road.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you could share what your observations or experiences about other institutions that form a collaborative effort with university environments or work in concert to further, whether it's education or creativity, how do they partner up?
There's a lot of examples of that, both with university-based museums, but also with partnerships in communities. between the museum and the university or college, and one will come to me, a good example, I hope will come to me, but where the college or university is able to take advantage of whatever program the museum is offering, not only for their own students to learn, but for their own students to learn how to teach, to become engaged. So museum education is extremely, a very, very important discipline in our field. So in Washington, we have George Washington University, great university. They are building a museum. They have it's going to be the textile museum, which already exists, which they acquired, brought in on campus, and then they have part of that new museum will be a major collection of Washingtoniana that dates back to the early 19th century, probably late 18th century, that a wealthy Washingtonian collected, and now they've just taken on the Corcoran Art Museum's, just in the last couple weeks, art school, and so the GW is really a leader in getting these young people who are in their museum education program hands-on experience in museums on their campus, but also in the museums around Washington. So how can these young people who are going to work in museums, how can they learn to be really good museum-based educators? And that education around the three-dimensional object, the original object, offers great opportunities because young people are just drawn to that. When we moved to Washington, they had just recently opened the Smithsonian's Museum of American History. And in there is the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag, reinstalled, spectacularly reinstalled. My daughter was 11. And the first time she saw that, she was just blown away. And every time some friend would come from out of town, she had to take them to see the Star-Spangled Banner because it had such an impact on her. And those original objects do that, and they create these connections that are unique, that allow colleges, high schools to partner with museums to make use of those resources. Museums have huge teaching collections. There's the stuff that's on the walls, but every museum has lots of objects that are available for use in teaching as well. I don't know if I answered your question or not. Yes?
So what sort of forums are in place, either through you or out there, where museums can share these ideas, so they're not reinventing the wheel, so they can find out what worked and...
That's a great question. The one thing about the museum field is we are over-organized, okay? We are really over-organized. And so there are so many places that where sharing and exchanges and partnerships go on in the museum field. We have 42 state museum associations. Iowa has a state museum association. There are 6 regional museum associations that cover the whole country. There are, I don't know, probably more than 20, probably close to 30 discipline-specific. A lot of them are very small. So every discipline, art museums, science technology centers, natural history museums, children's museums, public gardens, zoos, aquariums, railroad museums, maritime museums, Jewish museums, everybody has their own association. So, History Museum, the ASLH, History Museum. Everybody has their own discipline, and all of them have meetings. So, where people come together. Now, coming together in your discipline is important, because then you can learn some things that are specific. But then they come to these broader meetings like ours as well. So there are lots of opportunities for museums to be sharing. And our goal at AAM is to do a better job of creating sort of a spark out of interdisciplinary connections. Our assumption is, our belief is, that all these disciplines can learn from each other. That the zoos can learn from the art museums, you know. In the art museum, the collection doesn't move. In the zoo, the collection moves and has to be fed. So it's very different, but they still are doing things that they, and they know that. They know that they can learn from each other. So that's why our CEO track in Seattle that we're having, our CEO's one-day session, there is A to Z. It's Art Museums Museums. And it's the CEOs of a wide range of institutions. And we think that their coming together is really, really important because, you know, I don't remember much about my swine medicine lectures. I just remember that part about hybrid vigor, which really important. And when you get all those different people together from those different kinds of museums, you get the head of the Field Museum in Chicago together with the head of the Dallas Art Museum and the head of the Minnesota Historical Society and so forth, then you begin to get some interesting conversations going and some creativity about it, and some collaborative opportunities as well. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about social media and content delivery? I know only enough to be dangerous, but to me, that's the way we're going to communicate with each other. And what do you think the museums are doing well with that? And what could we learn from what museums are doing well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't even spell social media, so you know, I can't talk intelligently about that. But obviously, it's really important. About 2008, I think it was, a fellow, a reporter from the Washington Post came to interview me, and his thesis was that museums are toast because of the ability to access anything online. Okay. So, you know, I said, well, you mean to say that seeing the Mona Lisa online, not that seeing the Mona Lisa is a rewarding experience, but you and the 5 other million other people that are standing around, but is the same as seeing it in person? Is it the same online? He said, well, yeah, because the pictures are really good today. The resolution's really high. I said, that's not the point. You know, it's not. It's standing reasonably close to the actual canvas that, you know, Leonardo da Vinci worked himself, right? Or standing very close to the portable desk that Thomas Jefferson wrote many of his letters, his correspondence with John Adams on, and you're right there looking at that desk. Or standing in Julia Child's kitchen. You know, seeing a picture of that is not the same. So, IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, did a study, and there are about 600, at that time, there was about 600 million visits to museums online. Now this is probably 2005, 2006. But those people who went online were more likely to visit in person than those who didn't go online. And we think that that's the opportunity. Not to replace the experience of seeing the actual object, but the ability to find out what's there. What would I be interested in? If I go, what do I want to see? Maybe there's nothing there I want to see. But by putting their collections online, high quality reproductions, and allowing you to sort of curate your own tour in advance on your cell phone, then, you know, museums are, I think that the social media are offering great opportunities. Also, you know, networking, getting groups together. I don't know how this works, but young people, you know, lots of museums now are trying to reach out to young people with social events in the museum. Those are very, very popular. Even you went to at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and art is not exactly your thing, right? No? This is my daughter, so I can sing with her. So yeah, but they promote those. They promote these events. They can use social media to promote these events, and it's working. You know, there are lots of museums around the country have great evening events and special programs for whatever those groups are that have that are part of the alphabet that I can't keep track of. But people in their 20s and 30s who may not have been regular goers to the museum come there for a social event or some kind of other special event. Maybe it's a charitable event for some other organization, but it gets people in the door. And the key is, how do you get people in the door the first time? Because once you come in, a certain percentage of those people are going to have a great experience, and they're going to want to come back. So I think, I mean, social media offers a huge opportunity for museums, huge opportunity to connect to new audiences.
But you don't see it for content delivery.
Well, if you're writing a term paper, fantastic. I mean, I think the content, I do think there's content, I do think content delivery is going to be important. I think that museums possess enormous amounts of information in their collections, enormous amounts. And the ability to make that available online will be very, very important. Absolutely. And I think they're doing that more and more. It's not cheap. But I think more and more museums are making more and more of their collections and their information available online.
What are attendance trends right now in museums? Are they coming back from the 2008 challenge, and have we gotten all the way back?
Well, museum attendance never fluctuates too much overall, despite economic difficulties in the economy. The average museum admission price in the United States is $7. And 38% of museums are free. And most museums have a free day or reduced rate day or whatever to get people in the door. So museum attendance, you know, stays within a fairly narrow range between 750 million and 850 million, 900 million, something in that range. It stays very, very strong because in difficult economic times, people go to museums. You know, after 9/11, which is not difficult economic time, but national tragedy, museum attendance went way up because when things are difficult, people like places that are reassuring and that they know, and museums provide that. And so that phenomenon has been seen repeatedly in times of crisis where people go to museums because they are great community places. Now, that doesn't mean that individual museums in different areas, in the downturn of 2008, 2009, didn't have problems. And museums certainly suffered during that time because contributions went down and grants went down and their ability to serve their communities was compromised. So that was a very difficult time for the field. We saw staffs shrink and a lot of museum professionals out of work. And so that has begun to really improve. People are, when I talk to museum professionals in my travels, the institutions I visit are feeling much better. They're hiring again. They're building programs and so forth again. But it's taken several years to get to it. I mean, the traveling shows that you know, as you know, the people weren't doing the big expensive traveling shows. They were saying, what's in the collection? What's the show that we can create out of our collection that will bring people in the door? And that was great because that created some very, very interesting, unique programs and collections based on what the museum already owned. Necessity is the mother of invention.
We've had some discussions within our staff about this, but I'm curious what your perspective is. I've heard a lot of people when I've talked to them about this place, friends in the community, people like that, they'll say, well, I really don't know why I would go there because I'm not Czech, so I wouldn't have a reason. And I know people at the African American Museum who have the same problem where they say, yeah, people say, why would I go there? I'm not black. I don't have a reason to go to that museum. I'm curious if you've had experiences with other institutions around the country that are based in a specific cultural group but are trying to appeal to a much more, to a much wider audience, and if there have any strategies they've used to do that have been effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think every African American museum is working on that. Every ethnic museum is working on that, and I think, I mean, the Smithsonian is building the National Museum of African American History and Culture right now. I see it every day going up. But that isn't supposed to be a museum for African Americans. And I think what you're going to see Lonnie Bunch and his team there do is this is the history of our country, and this is everybody's history. And there's going to be lots of things there for people with a wide range of interests, whether it's arts and culture, whether it's music, whether it's literature. It's going to be there, and I think that's how you get people there. And it starts for museums out that are not part of the Smithsonian. It starts with how do you make those connections in the community? How do you make those connections through the school system? How do you offer programs that really help teachers teach something they're trying to get across, a lesson that is important? What are the programs you do that you bring them in the door? Maybe it starts by you're sending educators out to the school and materials out to the school, and then followed up by a field trip. And once you establish those patterns of young people, when young people go to museums, they go back. And if you get them in the door by creating some either community programs, something, a party, something special, a fair, whatever, or you get them in through the school programs, then you begin to build those long-time relationships. But it is a challenge. It is a challenge for museums that have that specific ethnic background to understand this isn't just for people of Czech and Slovak descent. This is about our city, it's about our state, and it's about our country. And there are really good stories there that need to be told. But it is a challenge.
I remember back when the last Trends thing came out,
Mhm.
and it talked some about museums serving their community, and I think what they were really getting at was being a place where discussion could be had in a safe
Yeah.
place on critical issues. And that's something that we're also looking at, and I'm kind of wondering what's happening out there in that realm.
Well, museums and libraries are both great neutral spaces where people can come. They're trusted. Museums and libraries are the most trusted institutions in our country consistently in surveys. The museums and libraries are the most trusted. So if there's a community issue and the community needs to face, you'll see museums and libraries, whether it's, you name us, I can't speak for libraries as well, although libraries have become very, very important social service agencies now, and the ALA, the American Library Association, has somebody there who wakes up every day thinking about social services that libraries are providing and how they're going to do a better job, how they're going to meet community needs. But on the museum side, I can tell you name a societal problem, I will find you a museum that's working on that problem, whether it's children and their families caught up in the juvenile justice system, or whether it's issues related to Alzheimer's and their patients, or young people on the autism spectrum. There are museums that are working on that, and part of that effort is convening, is bringing people together to talk about this community issue, and how it can be better addressed, and how people can be supported. I've heard everything imaginable in my travels over the past 7 years about programs that museums have based on needs of the community. And that's what both museums and libraries do. What is the need that we can fill? And people say, well, Ford, why would a museum have a program to help new Americans learn English, to help prepare them for their first job? Why would a museum do that? Well, let's see. Museums have facilities, they have libraries, they have classrooms, they have computers, they have education experts, and they have volunteers. You know how many hours Americans volunteer for museums in this country every week? In 1 week, guess how many hours Americans donate of their time to museums? Somebody guess.
50,000.
50,000.
700.
How much?
700,000?
700,000. You're getting warm. It's 1 million every week. Americans donate 1 million hours of time. So museums are able to bring that incredible amount of volunteer time to bear on whatever the community issue is, whatever the museum's trying to accomplish, whether it's their latest show, their latest program, or whether it's how are we going to reach out to the community. One of the things that museums are working on with libraries is grade level reading, having all young people up to reading skills, appropriate reading skills by grade 3. And that's a big project. The Institute of Museum and Library Services is behind that. And it's a perfect role for museums of all types, including art museums or zoos. It doesn't matter. Because, again, all of these institutions have these resources that they can bring to bear to help meet this problem.
Trying to think about our own, I know all the wheels are turning here because we're, having been through this recovery that we've been through in the last 5 to 6 years, we're really finally getting to focus on programming, instead of just, opening. And now we have a system now to, for visitors and so forth.
Right.
And so I think we're catching up a bit on what's going on and trying to find the right place for our, kind of the stories we hold, if you will.
Right.
And, how to use those and how to take those in a, substantive way.
Well, in 1900, the first real museum thinker, John Cotton Dana, who's the founder of the Newark Museum, which is our board chair right now, is the COO of the Newark Museum. It's a venerable, great institution. But John Cotton Dana said about museums, if you're starting a museum, he said, identify what the community needs, fit the museum to meet those needs. And that was 114 years ago. And that hasn't changed a bit, not one bit. I think it took a long time for museums to actually begin doing that well, but I think for a long, long time, they weren't really spending time trying to identify community needs, and then thinking, what could we do? Now, museums can't address all community needs, but in a given community, there's a need that a museum, with its resources, can address, can bring people together, can be a convener, can provide programs, again, for Alzheimer's patients and their caregivers, or whatever it is that museums can do, that they have a unique ability with their volunteers and their staff and their resources. I went to San Angelo, Texas, in January. San Angelo, Texas is the largest city that is more than 100 miles from an interstate. Because they brag all the time. It's a population of about 100,000. There's nothing around there. There's nothing. There's no other cities. And they have serious water issues in San Angelo. And there's a lot of cattle wandering around out there in that dry area. And there used to be oil. I don't know how much oil there is now. But in San Angelo, there's the San Angelo Art Museum, run by a great character named Howard Taylor. And he came from Philadelphia to San Angelo. It's quite a culture shock. He's been there over 20 years now. And as I went around that community, everybody said to me, we would be nothing without that art museum. We would be nothing. He has, first thing he did was, he's been very, very active in the redevelopment of the downtown. He's helped lead the charge. He's bought buildings. He said, I bought that building. And we went walking around, he said, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with it, but I'm going to find something to do with it. One of the buildings he bought, he created a environmental studies program on water for elementary school children. This is the art museum. And I visited it. And there it is, right across the street from his art museum. And he partners with the Upper Colorado River Authority, and they create a curriculum for elementary school children who come in, study water quality, study organisms in the water, study fish, everything, because water is such an important issue there in that part of the country. And that program is wildly successful. Every 3 years, I think he holds a design competition for ideas that people have to beautify the community, to create value. And there are bridges, and there are squares, and there are walkways along the river that grew out of that initiative started by the Art Museum. So the San Angelo Art Museum, which makes its space available for community meetings all the time. People come in there, they can use it. They have all kinds of programs for senior citizens and for kids in the museum. And again, as I said, everywhere I went, people said, this museum has made such a difference. When they needed a new central library, Howard was involved in the fundraising, made calls with the head of the library, and then he took 4,000 square feet in the library for his own programming because it's downtown. Now, so the museum will not have its programming out there. That's the best example I can think of a museum that has made itself absolutely essential. Absolutely essential to its community, doing things that you would say, well, why would an art museum do that? It's not why would an art museum do that, it's why wouldn't a museum do that? A trusted community institution. Yeah.
So, as a member of the government side of things, I don't live this day in, day out, and my travels take me around things. How do I find those gems? How do I go and understand the stories of the people who are doing things differently? How do you take that time to understand San Diego Public Library, focused in on how can we help the foreclosure of our community? Again, that's something that, so you start hearing about these little stories,
Right.
and then as your travels take you there, you go, I want to make sure I can visit that place. How would you recommend that we're on the other side of it, who aren't living this day in and day out, that are
Well,
reminding ourselves of
yeah.
these opportunities?
The thing is to visit museums, and you may visit, you'll visit some that maybe don't excite you what they're doing, but you'll find, because this is what I do, is I visit museums, and the vast majority of them are doing amazing things that I would never, ever have expected them to be doing. You may have to ask, but say, visit a museum and say, what are you doing in the community? Tell me what you're doing in the community. How are you making a difference in this community? And you'll hear very, very interesting stories about what museums are doing in their communities. Again, it'll surprise you because they're very creative, they're very unexpected. And you go to some, maybe you won't find it particularly exciting, but In my experience, the museums I've gone to, and I spend a lot of time going to museums in small towns, it's amazing what you hear going on. One of my favorite museums is in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. It's the Walter Anderson Museum of Art. I don't know, I thought Walter Anderson was the person who built the museum, but Walter Anderson is an artist. He's a very famous artist, as it turns out. I'm not an art person. But, and his work is in lots of collections. And the museum has a staff of, I think, 3 or 4, maybe 3. And they have his artwork, and which is spectacular. And his story is spectacular. He was crazier than a coot. He did natural history painting, and he felt that for example, he used to paint on an island off the Gulf. Ocean Springs is right next to Biloxi, right on the Gulf. And he would row himself out to an island 4 miles out and paint. Well, when he heard there was a hurricane coming, he thought, I need to experience the hurricane. So he lashed himself to a tree and watched the hurricane hit. And the museum tells the story of his life, but they work with the schools there in Ocean Springs, which is not a very big town, and use his art to help teach the young people there about the natural history of their area. About, you know, they've had that devastating hurricane, not that long ago, and they use his artwork to talk about how does a hurricane affect the natural history? How is it part of renewal? How does the flora and fauna come back? They use it for all kinds of really creative educational programming. And this is a tiny museum with virtually no staff. But they have something important, which is his amazing, amazing artwork. If you go down to Ocean Springs, he created a mural on 3 walls, well, actually almost 4, because the door comes in. It's a mural of the history of the region, the political history, and the history of the flora and fauna. It's a spectacular mural. You can go anywhere in the world, you will never see a mural that is better than that one. And it's the community center, and people were leaning against it, and they didn't have windows that were screening out UV light, but they got a big grant from NEH, and they restored the mural, and they have the right windows, and they have guards protecting the mural. But that mural itself, kids stand there, I saw them stand there and just stare at that, trying to figure out what that story was they were seeing. And it's absolutely spectacular. So there's all kinds of, I mean, that's a museum you might not go to if you just saw it in a guidebook or something. And it's accredited. It's an accredited museum. They made up their mind they were going to be among the best, just like this one did, and they got accredited. So if you go to them, I think in most museums you'll find a story. That was a long, long answer. Simple.
I think one of the challenges that we face is, you were talking about community. And being a national museum, our community is the nation.
Right.
We have some really good things that we take out on the road. We're working with people in a variety of cities. What dynamic programs have you seen from other museums that are trying to do the same thing, that just made you sit back and say, wow, this is really working?
Well, I don't know if I can think of one that meets that exact need of, you know, going out, but I think that just your story of you're collecting these histories as a way of teaching us Americans about critical issues through the stories of the Czechoslovak heritage, and collecting those stories, and then, you know, I think some of the people who do that well then use some of the really good stories to get people's attention. You know, people that have made a difference in their communities that come from whatever tradition or whatever ethnic origin, and really celebrating those stories in unique ways. I think that it's really, really important. I think that the key is this isn't about, as you know, as your website says, this isn't about people of Czechoslovak heritage. These are universal lessons that we can, and I think that's the challenge. Maybe I'll think of somebody that does that well. I don't know if there's anybody quite. Who would you say is closest to you, Gail, in terms of their mission? One other museums.
Japanese American Museum. in LA. However, they have such a huge Japanese American community
They
right
do,
there
yeah.
that, but that's one.
That's a good example.
Arab American.
Yeah, the Arab, you know, they have a huge, very significant population there as well. But and I don't know if, does the Arab American Museum, are they going around the country? They're not doing oral histories like you are, right?
I don't.
I don't think they are. I think the Japanese American National Museum has definitely done oral histories. I don't know about the Arab American, but those are both great examples. I don't know if I can come up with a.
It's an interesting challenge we deal with all the time. You know, we have 2,000 members and 1,200 of them don't live in Iowa. You know, and so.
That's great.
We try, it's great, but we try to reach those people and take things to them, because they, you know, they faithfully come to see us, but once a year maybe, you know, and so how can we, you know, do more and make it work?
You're doing oral histories in Cleveland and Chicago
We did,
and
yeah.
a lot of different cities.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you do events there, or you
Yeah.
as well.
Some, and we're trying to expand that more now.
You have some of those people that are members to do, you know, the host events for you. That's
It's
expanding the circle.
It's very grassroots right now, and we had the benefit of the flood story, the flood that brought this organization to the awareness of so many people that didn't. We've actually built our membership up because of it. And now they've seen the miraculous things that we've done, from just basically recovering from you know, just getting on our feet off of a flood, but to moving a building to bringing in the extraordinary things we have. Now they're saying, hey, what can you bring to us? And we've got, as I said, we've got some touring exhibits that are wonderful. One of them is spun off of the oral history. We commissioned a play that we're taking on the road based on the oral history. And then we bring in the people that gave the oral histories to do the little colloquia among those. So that's what we're working on right now. And I think it has some good wow factor for these folks that are the people we're talking to like it. I was just wondering if there's something else out there.
Well, of course, you have the ability to create unique exhibits, traveling exhibits. I don't know, because you've got resources nobody else has. And so traveling exhibitions is a great, I think a great opportunity to build our own news stories. Museums are always looking for content. Yeah.
Are you seeing any trends with membership with museums? Because, you know, the younger generation and how to get them involved, and just, have you seen anything there?
Yeah, well, the one thing that, you know, that I know a lot of museums are talking about is, in some museums there's this big differentiation between membership and development and donations. And, you know, I know some museums are saying, well, if you give us a donation, you're a member. We're not going to have that divide, because we want you to feel like you belong. And so you're going to get a membership when you make a contribution, because that way, you know, we have you. Membership is obviously very, very, very important to museums. For museums that charge admission, admission charges are a tiny percentage of the museum's budget. It's 2-3%. You know, in some museums it's higher, it's 7 or 8%, but generally it's not. So the membership is important, because your members are more likely to have an ongoing relationship, and their members are more likely to be donors than people who aren't members. So I think building that membership remains extremely, extremely important. It gives you that way to reach people, to tell them story about new programs, about new exhibitions, about things you're doing in the community, and asking them to get other members, you know. Bring people, bring somebody, you know. We have a special exhibit, bring a friend, and he or she gets, you know, free admission or half admission or whatever. So members are very, very, remain very, very important to museums.
Lord, I want to thank you for coming.
Oh.
You make me proud to be in this, well, I always am proud, but proud to be in this business. proud to be part of museum
We're
work.
proud to have a winner of the National Medal for Museum and Library Service as an accredited member of AAM, I can tell you.
Thank you. So.
You're very welcome.
And thanks for your leadership in this field. We really appreciate it.
I have a great job. I get to work with lots of great people, lots of great people.
And thanks to your daughter for coming along.
Just keep me company.
Everybody.